Good evening, everybody. Welcome. And on behalf of my colleague, Alan Levine, and everyone at the Political Theory Institute, I want to welcome you to our first event of the fall 2022 semester. This is our annual event in honor of Constitution Day and is being sponsored by the Constitution Day Initiative at the Jack Miller Center. My name is Sarah Hauser, and I am a professorial lecturer in the government department here at American University. And tonight I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Smith, who is the Alfred Cowles Professor of Political Science at Yale University. Dr. Smith received his PhD from the University of Chicago and has taught at Yale since 1984. He is the author of Modernity and Its Discontents, The Making and Unmaking of the Bourgeois from Machiavelli to Bellow, as well as books on Hegel, Spinoza, and Leo Strauss. But tonight we will be discussing his most recent book, Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes. So welcome, Dr. Smith, and thank you for joining us.
My pleasure to be joining you. I only wish I could be there, but it was impossible for me to get down today. So I'm happy to be with you on Zoom.
Thank you. So before we get started tonight, I want to make a couple of announcements. The first is, as I said, this is our first event of the semester, so I want to tell you all about the rest of our events. So on October 6th, Professor Levine will be back in this chair and having a conversation with Arthur Herman of the Hudson Institute on the idea of decline in the West. And October 18th, Zena Hitz of St. John's College, Annapolis will be delivering our annual Lincoln Scholars Lecture entitled Why You Shouldn't Want to Rule the World or Take Another Internship. And this, we're very excited to say, is going to be live in person on AU's campus. On October 24th, Robert Pepperman Taylor of the University of Vermont will speak on lessons from Walden, Thoreau, and the crisis of American democracy. And that is also live online with Professor Levine. On November 9th, Anika Prather of Howard University and Angel Adams Parham of the University of Virginia will be discussing their new book, The Black Intellectual Tradition. And that's also on campus. And finally, on December 1st, Professor Levine will be discussing anti-racism as practiced today with John McWhorter of Columbia University. So tonight, for our conversation with Professor Smith, it follows this format. Basically, he and I will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session from the audience. You can submit your questions through the Q&A function at any time during our conversation. And please remember to include your name and affiliation along with your question. Okay, so let's get started. I guess I'll just start, Professor Smith, with the question, why are we reclaiming patriotism and who are we reclaiming it from? So. Okay,
that's jumping in at the deep end. Good, that's fine. Let me just say one thing. Is a piece of self-advertisement for you mentioned you're kind enough to hold up the book for those listeners who might be interested. I just heard the book is coming out, will be out in paperback any day. So if you want to be able to get it at a cheaper edition, you can get the paperback coming out any day. But who are we claiming it from? That's really the central theme of the book. Because the full title is Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes. What are the extremes? The extremes are two, you might say, on the left and the right. There's a left form of anti-patriotism that I wrote about in the book, and that in some ways comes in different forms, but it takes the most prominent, I think, is the form of kind of transnational cosmopolitanism. The idea that we are citizens of the world today, that national borders and national identities and allegiances belong to the past, in fact, belong to a kind of benighted past that we should be grateful to move beyond as we think of ourselves as, again, citizens of the world tackling, increasingly global problems and thinking of citizenship and nationality and patriotism as sort of things of the past on the one side. On the other side, the book makes a distinction between patriotism and what has become the sort of nationalist right. And that, I think, is the distinction that has received quite a bit of attention. And because what is it? Sometimes nationalism and patriotism are thought of as largely synonymous. And throughout a fair bit of history, they were. In the 19th century, nationalist movements arose as movements of national liberation, and they were connected, very much connected with patriotism. But in the 20th century, particularly, nationalism, took a very different turn. It was not so much about love of country. It was not so much about gratitude for, who we are and what our countries have done for us. It's become a kind of militant doctrine of us versus them. The world, as the nationalist sees it, is divided between friend and enemy, and it's important to know which side to choose up sides. And of course, that distinction between us and them, friend and enemy, turns out not just to be a distinction between one country and another country. It becomes a way of distinguishing domestic distinctions between people who belong and people who don't. One recent American nationalist said that half the American country can't be said to be Americans in any meaningful sense of the term. So nationalism, as I have come to see it, is a very different animal than patriotism, although it often likes to endorse the language or to use the language of patriotism. In fact, the two mean quite different things, especially in America, I think in the American context. So those are, broadly speaking, the two extremes that the book is attempting to recapture patriotism from. Sarah, I can't hear you.
I'm sorry, that was my bad. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what the content of your idea of enlightened patriotism is that you advocate for in the book, and sort of what exactly is Enlightenment patriotism and how is it different from patriotism as we traditionally think about it?
Good. I mean, patriotism, as the word, suggests, it comes from a Latin word, patria, a country. I mean, it's a Roman term, a Latin term. It goes back a long ways. Love of the land, love of the soil. Patriotism. In fact, let me just nationalism, by the way, happens to be a modern concept. Began to emerge in, I think, the late 18th and early 19th century. Patriotism, by contrast, is an ancient term. It goes back quite a long ways, or its root goes back a very long way. What I argue in the book is that what distinguishes American patriotism, and the book is largely a book about American patriotism. I don't attempt to give us a kind of theory of patriotism in general. It is kind of very much rooted in the American experience. What distinguishes American patriotism, I think, is not that ours is not a patriotism of blood and soil, as is so often the case, or was so often the case in European countries. Ours is very much a patriotism, as I describe it in the book, a patriotism of ideas, a patriotism of principles. It's rooted in the founding texts of the American experience, and in particular, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and a few others. We are, unlike, again, other nations, many other nations, we are a people, if not exactly a people of the book, a people of books, a people of texts. And our texts, as I believe it, our patriotism, is rooted in the idea of human equality, of government by consent and of human rights, individual rights. This is the core of our patriotism, and our institutions and so on are designed in a way to make those concepts, bring those concepts and bring those ideas into life. Our patriotism, because it is rooted in these ideas, it's aspirational. Those ideas are never fully, or at best, we could say they are imperfectly realized. Our patriotism is aspirational. We always are, in a way, we are a kind of work in progress, always seeking, in a way, to move forward in achieving those ideals. Our national history has been, in many ways, a slow but steady progress to achieving the ideals set out fundamentally in the Declaration. So I want to maintain very much this aspirational aspect to this idealist, as it were, aspect or aspirational aspect to American patriotism, that it doesn't rest content with who we are. It's not my country, right or wrong. And it's not, particularly in a nation of immigrants, it's not a patriotism of land and soil. What we share as a people is a commitment to these fundamental ideas. And that's what I think of as at the core of what in the book I called Enlightened Patriotism.
So you say that the patriot in America, at least, is attached, what he's attached to is a set of ideas. Mm-hmm. Just the set of ideas? I mean, you seem to talk, I think in the book, you make this distinction between logos and ethos. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, good, because I have emphasized one side of patriotism. It's not, and that's not the whole story. Because ideas to be meaningful, and I use, as you just pointed out, these two Greek words, logos and ethos. Logos meaning the kind of things I'm talking about, principles, foundational texts, ideas. But ideas also need to be supported by what I call ethos, another Greek word meaning something like our moral habits, our traditions, our dispositions and sentiments. These are also very much a part of what patriotism requires, and not just a commitment to ideas and principles and aspirations are great and necessary, but they need to be supported by our feelings and by our habits and ethos. Tocqueville, famous phrase from Tocqueville, he spoke about the habits of the heart. And I think of patriotism also very much in that way. It is a principle, but it is also something that has to be, to some degree, ingrained in our habits, our sentiments, our practice, our moral practices and institutions. You know, we celebrate the 4th. Just take a kind of obvious example, our celebration of the 4th of July. I mean, it may just consist of, you know, family barbecues and so on, gathering with friends and family in the backyard for eating hamburgers and hot dogs, and I love that. But also, as we do every year with our friends, it goes along with reading the Declaration of Independence aloud and hearing. It's one example of a kind of moral practice that I think is important to sustain a sense of patriotism. If I can use another example, perhaps a little more controversial, although maybe not, but it has become controversial in recent times. You know, standing at the playing of the National Anthem is a way of affirming our patriotism. Mm-hmm. So anyone who knows, I'll just give one mm-hmm. example. Anyone who knows me, I don't know if there's anybody out there who really does. Alan knows me, but I don't know whether he knows this about me. I'm a big New York Yankees fan, and I go to a lot of games. And it's with every sporting event, the National Anthem is played beforehand, and people stand in a kind of respectful dignity. And some bring flags in the bleachers. The bleacher people bring flags. It's always, and I think it's a routine, you could say, but routines have meaning, and I think standing and paying a moment of quiet respect is a very important way of affirming patriotism. Could give many other examples, but they're just a couple that I throw out there.
So is it fair to say then that the ethos is more like a public culture, like being attached to a culture, than it is about being attached to a set of ideas?
Yes.
I guess
Right.
the
Yes.
reason why I ask is because it seems like the ethos that you've talked about is a bit closer to what nationalism is a bit closer to what the nationalist is attached to.
Right. I think, let me go back a little bit and kind of reframe this idea. When I talk about, patriotism as distinct from the kind of cosmopolitan and nationalist dispositions, the way I frame this in the book and the way I sort of think about it for myself is, I think at core, I'm kind of an Aristotelian. And what is that? What do I mean by that? Aristotle famously described all the virtues as being a mean between extremes of excess, what he called excess and deficiency. So, take one example, bravery, courage, is a mean rather between rashness on the one hand, kind of excessive, and cowardice on the other. And he uses this as a kind of formula. And I began to think of patriotism as a kind of on this Aristotelian continuum. And one feature of having it as a continuum is, of course, there are moments and there are aspects where the two shade into one another. These don't exist as, watertight silos that do not touch each other. So for example, so when I talk about ethos, that is something that nationalists would accept, I'm sure. Yeah, absolutely. And when I talk about rights and our commitment to equality, that's something cosmopolitans certainly, it kind of touches on that side, because there's the Declaration doesn't speak of equality as just a fact of American life. It's a human quality. It's a feature of human nature. So, right, I mean, these two do touch, and there are areas where we could even there's not a airtight. I think the distinction is important. It's important to keep the distinction in mind, to have the distinction, but to bear in mind that, like all distinctions, there's always a kind of edge where they touch and even blend at a certain point.
So the reason I asked is because this has, I think, some people have argued for something like a kind of civic nationalism, some different thinkers, and that what that means is being attached in some sense to a set of ideas, but also to a set of, a culture, basically, a kind of public culture.
Right.
I'm thinking, for example, of David Miller's work on this subject. And it could be then that the difference between what you're talking about and what nationalism has maybe more to do with the sort of what you might call the mode of attachment. That is the nature of the attachment itself. Like, is it a kind of love, a kind of loyalty?
Right. Well, I mean, many people will use, different names for this. I mean, civic nationalism may be fairly close to what I'm talking about. The German philosopher Jürgen Habermas talks about constitutional patriotism. Also, I actually talk a little bit about his writing and sort of want to distinguish myself from it. But these are all in some way, sort of in the same ballpark. And in many ways, the kind of nationalism that David Miller has spoken about is still civic nationalism, and my friend Maurizio Viroli has also written about this as well. There's nothing really, I don't really have a problem with that.
Okay.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with, there's not really a problem with that. It's, to me, and also, by the way, I was in a recent exchange recently about the book with Michael Walzer, political theorist Michael Walzer, who also defends a certain kind of nationalism. He prefers nationalism to patriotism, and he's got a different. And again, to some degree, we're all, I think, in the same broad family. To me, however, nationalism has become, to me, I mean, in my take at least, it's developed a kind of toxic quality that I may be speaking a little too harshly, but it has become, I think, kind of irredeemable for the purposes of kind of liberal constitutionalism of the kind I want to suggest. And one example I used in the book, and I also used when I was responding in my response to Michael Walzer, who said, patriotism is, he didn't like the term, he didn't like the use of the term as much. I said, today, when people use terms like white nationalism or this kind of ethnic nationalism, that's, we immediately understand what that means. It makes a certain kind of sense. No one ever uses the term white patriotism.
Right.
And so I do think the two are very different. And that's why I want to, although admitting that, we may share a broad, family resemblance, if you want to use that term, words are still important. Words are important, and distinctions are important. And for my own reasons, I think patriotism is a better term to reclaim for the purposes of a kind of what I think of as a kind of decent liberal constitutionalism than nationalism. So I'll just kind of throw that out there. And if people want to reply later on, or if you do, please feel free.
So the content of what it is that you're talking about, these ideas that everyone is united by, those you would describe basically as the principles of the Declaration of Independence, that those are what Americans are attached to?
Broadly speaking, but I want to go a little bit beyond that. And in fact, the last chapter of the book spells out a variety of ideas, that I think are, or a variety of not really ideas, but practices and ideas that I think are at the core of our idea of what I call enlightened patriotism. This certainly includes equality, liberty. It suggests a certain appreciation of our national diversity, which is a pluralism and diversity, I think, are very important. We are, as we were talking about earlier, we're a nation of immigrants. We bring different, we bring different customs and habits and sensibilities to the table. And I think that diversity is a very valuable part of our patriotism. But I also think things too I speak about in the end of the book about the importance of a culture of arts and truthfulness. Truthfulness, I think, is important. And I think a culture of hope, which we talked about that earlier too in our meeting with the students. These are all patriotic, I think, and democratic values that I mean, they're not just, you can't just read them out of the Declaration of Independence or something, but I did want to provide something of a list of qualities that I think were said, qualities, practices, as it were, habits of the heart that help to make patriotism real.
I think a lot of people might question today whether or not Americans still believe in those kinds of ideas that you've mentioned. Do you understand your understanding of enlightened patriotism as more descriptive or more aspirational?
A bit of both. I mean, sure, I draw on what I think are deep-rooted values and beliefs that come out of American history and American political thought, which is my area after all. But of course, I realize, we're not and never have been just a consensus-based society. We've always, been in some way in conflict with ourselves. So the book it's both in that way, it's both descriptive but aspirational. And it's as being part of aspirational, it's hopefully educational. I'm a teacher after all. I'm trying to educate and trying to convince and persuade readers to agree with me, to argue with me, or to agree with me, or hopefully some of both. But so I do. The book is written in a mood of a kind of cautious hopefulness that that readers will take it to heart.
I think many people might suggest that although we sort of could endorse commonly a theory of egalitarianism or a value of egalitarianism and a value of freedom, that what we primarily disagree about is the meaning of those terms, the application of those terms. Absolutely. And so it seems like if we disagree profoundly about the application or the meaning of those terms, then there isn't much that really is uniting us.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is something to what you say. We do disagree about what freedom means and what equality means, and how much equality a free society should endorse, and how much freedom, and to some degree we are aware of the tension between them. And I don't necessarily see that as a problem. I mean, once again, I don't have an algorithm, and nobody does, frankly, for describing or to solving that question. It's not like a geometry question that admits a kind of proof at the end of the day. And these values that I've tried to sketch out are in tension with one another. Mm-hmm. Like anything, people can press these to the extreme. Libertarians would give you the impression that a certain kind of individual freedom is the only trump card, is the final ace of trumps, as it were, in the deck. Or others will tell you more equality, only equality is what we need. Every value, every moral principle can admit a certain kind of extremism. At the end of the day, I remain, in this respect, a kind of pluralist who believes that none of these values can simply ride. We can't afford for them to ride roughshod over the other, but it's a decent polity is one that maintains a kind of balance of these things, of these different aspirations. We will disagree. That's part of life. I mean, absolutely. And disagreement is central. But I think in the form of that disagreement, we have to maintain a certain kind of moderation and balance between that. I think that's again a kind of Aristotelian view between competing and rival goods. There's not one single good for that. One size fits all. Any social order of any degree of complexity is going to admit a plurality of ends and goods, and we have to learn how to live with each other with a kind of respect and also a kind of self-restraint, knowing that our own views, however deeply attached we are to them, not everybody is in the same way. So that may be overly optimistic, but I still think it's an important lesson that we always need to be relearning.
I wanted to ask you about some of the things that you might consider to be an act of a patriot, and particular about the relationship between patriotism and protest, or patriotism and revolution, for that matter, in your view.
Yeah.
Because it seems that if what you're attached to is the ideas of a country, that would sort of limit, to a certain extent, the amount that a patriot could be not in favor of those ideas, or could be a revolutionary, for example.
Well, I don't think that patriotism and revolution are really compatible, but I mean, we've talked before about, and it comes up, I talk about it at the end of the book, patriotism is and protest. When is protest patriotic? When does it affirm what we believe in, what our highest values are, and when does it kind of undermine, when does it seek to undermine those values? Again, in a way, there's no bright line in the sand about this, but I would say, as I do in the book, that protest is patriotic when it seeks to affirm our basic values in liberty and in equality, and particularly when protesters, and we spoke about this earlier also, take responsibility for their deeds. That's what made Martin Luther King's protest one of the highest expressions of patriotism for me, because not only did he invoke, in doing so, American values and beliefs, and tried to show Americans how racial laws and segregation laws were in violation of our own basic principles. But he did so with a kind of dignity and responsibility, taking ownership for his protest, even going to prison for his protest. And that to me is an act of the highest form of, you might say, protest patriotism. Very different from the kind of violent expressions of protests that we've seen many times before, and that seem to be inflamed not so much by American ideals, but a kind of nihilistic rage at what are perceived to be moral wrongs that don't, on their side, admit any real redress.
So a patriot could be a reformer, but not a revolutionary.
Absolutely.
In our view. Mm-hmm. I mean, what about a sort of nation? I know you said that this idea of patriotism that you have applies mostly to America.
Yeah.
But it seems like the advantage of it is that at least it allows us to avoid some of the extremes that are associated with nationalism. But if a country doesn't have a sort of founding philosophy in the same way that America has, do they have any recourse to this understanding of patriotism, or to reform in that kind of way?
That's a great question, and it's a difficult one to answer. It's one I'll just use one example because it kind of comes to mind from the book, where I talk about the German case, and I talked about Jürgen Habermas's discussion of what he calls constitutional patriotism. Obviously, Germany's had a very difficult history when it comes to nationalism and patriotism. It hasn't always ended so well. And in many ways, one of the reasons that, in my view, nationalism has come to have the negative implication that it does is in part because of the German example. And yet Habermas seems understood at the same time, writing in recent times, that every country, love of country is important for people. It's an important manner. And he was attacked for this idea from many kind of on the left who didn't like invoking patriotism of any kind. And his idea of constitutional patriotism was loyalty to the German, what's called in Germany the Grundgesetz, the foundational law. It's law of principle. It's constitutional. It's the constitution of the modern German Republic. And I thought that was great. I mean, in some ways, I thought it was great for Germany. I would say it was great for Germany. What it didn't do, and I can absolutely understand why he didn't want to go down this path, because it can go in a bad direction. He didn't want to invoke what I call ethos patriotism as well, because it can morph into the kind of blood and soil nationalism that has troubled so many countries. But I think that's an example, a very decent example of a thinker trying to invoke a kind of patriotism for their purposes. And I thought that was good because, in many ways, modern Europeans, for a range of historical reasons that are completely understandable, have completely repudiated patriotism. They associate it with the two world wars, and the European experience with nationalism and patriotism has led to some bad things. And it's led to a repudiation of it. And the EU seems to be a new kind of transnational society. I talk a little bit about this in the book, that wants to be at least above patriotism and above nationalism in some ways. But I'm not sure that's working. And I'm not going to sit and gloat about, some of the problems of the EU. I think the EU has done some incredible things. And I think in many ways it's been very good. But I think it has not acknowledged, among other things, people's kind of their need to belong, a sense of national belongingness, which I think remains very much a part of people's beliefs. And you see that a little bit today. Actually, you see a lot of it after listening to, after the death of the Queen. Britons feel a moment of national unity and around something, at least the Queen Elizabeth, that they could feel a sense of pride. And I don't know that the relation or the the monarchy, I don't know how long this will last after this brief period of mourning, but it does show a kind of need of people who need a sense of patriotism and a sense of belongingness, which transcends just standard party politics and ordinary forms of partisanship and so on.
Yeah, it seems as if that in America, we kind of are able to combine the ethos and the logos in a certain kind of way that makes this kind of enlightened patriotism a possible solution for us. But that wouldn't necessarily be true in other countries. And we still have, the question still remains to us, of course, what is the Patriot's attitude towards his illiberal past? Mm-hmm. And you can say with Americans, well, maybe we have an illiberal past in practice, but our ideas have always been sort of liberal. But you can't necessarily say that about other countries.
Right. Right. And I mean, my book isn't written in the spirit of, we're better somehow, we're better. I do believe in American exceptionalism. And part of what I'm talking about is this combination of ideas and practice, moral practices is I think our form of exceptionalism in some respects. I'm not sure it's something that is transportable, or it's every place is different.
Mhm.
I feel we are still in many ways. We see people coming here all the time. People aren't leaving. People aren't trying to leave, as they are in Russia. We're not walling them in. We're not keeping them here. People want to come here. There must be a reason for that. It's because we offer freedom and opportunity of a kind, and a kind of generosity.
Right.
DeSantis notwithstanding, we offer a kind of generosity to people in distress and who are seeking better lives for themselves. Is this messy? Yes. But I do think this is a certain form of American exceptionalism in which we can take a genuine pride.
I wanted to remind everyone to please put your questions into the Q&A. We're just going to talk for a couple more minutes, and then we'll start to take some questions from the audience. So I guess, what do you think are the sort of practical measures which could be undertaken in order to sort of proselytize your idea of enlightened patriotism and to fight against the opposite?
Well, one of the things I think we are suffering from at the moment is the deficiency of truthfulness. When some large percentage of the country believes that an election was stolen, when they are fed lies and conspiracy theories for the sole purpose, the sole and single purpose of dividing Americans from one another. That, I think, is something that any decent patriotism has to struggle and to fight against. And I don't want the idea of enlightened patriotism just to be thought of as a kind of middle of the road doctrine, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. In the 1950s, the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. coined a phrase that has become actually very important recently. He talked about the vital center in that context, in the struggle against communism. How liberal how democratic societies need to respond to totalitarianism. And he coined the phrase the vital center. And I think that's what my idea of patriotism is trying to recapture, some idea of a vital center, of which is, again, a kind of fighting ideology in a way. It's not just a sort of, again, it shouldn't, hope it doesn't come off as just a kind of milquetoast, some of this, some of that. It needs to push back. It needs to learn to, a kind of enlightened patriotism needs to push back against and needs to learn to, both from those on the left and those on the right, to reclaim that vital center, which I think is the best of American politics, best of America.
What would you say to someone who listens to this conversation and believes that they can't be patriotic because they live in a fundamentally unjust regime, or a regime that is founded in racism, a regime that is founded in elitism? What would you say to, I think that that kind of person exists who would listen to this speech. What would you say to that?
Well, look at history, read our history. Yes, I mean, there is, if you're referring to something like the 1619 Project and people who believe that, like anything, there's some truth to it. It's not, I don't believe it's just false. That's some truth. but American history has been a constant struggle, and successful in some respects, not perfect, and certainly not perfect in others. But I think there has been a broadly upward trajectory in our struggle to overcome a very imperfect past. Are we perfect? Of course not. That's ridiculous. But to hold standards of perfection that no people on earth could possibly achieve, and then because of this failure to fall into a fit of kind of hatred, and negativity, I think is utterly the wrong conclusion to draw. I mean, tell me where these problems have. No, I think a serious engagement with our history and with our struggles. And I say in the book, one reason I cannot accept that view is because it overlooks the heroism and the struggle of generations of Americans, both Black and white, to struggle against and improve upon an imperfect past.
Okay, I think it's time to take a couple of questions here from the audience. Thank you very much. Thank you to those of you who sent in questions, and please keep them coming. This is from Vincent Hanrahan, a student at AU. Does nationalism or patriotism require a state of war or an othered common enemy who is to be the subject of our violence?
That in a sense is my critique of the nationalist disposition. It is about othering other people, othering people. Mm-hmm. It begins by distinguishing one country from another, but it ends up by othering, creating domestic enemies, whether these are, whether this is based on race or ethnicity or religion. They'll always find a reason to other, as it were, as we kind of verbicide that word,
right?
Other people. And that I think that's why I have come to think that nationalism is in a way sort of irredeemable. It has too much tainted with that kind of language and disposition, where I think patriotism is a far more generous, at least as I want to use the term in the book. There's a generosity about it. There's an attempt to embrace, and it can try to embrace otherness within, not just others, but to embrace otherness within a common framework of public belief.
Okay, this one doesn't have a name for.
Thank you, Vincent, for that, though.
This one doesn't have a name to it, but I think it's a good question. Was Socrates a patriot?
That's good. Talk a little bit about Socrates at the end of the book, by the way. And it's always a good question. Was Socrates a patriot? Well, I'm gonna say yes and no. Yes and no. He was certainly a patriot in the sense, if you look at the Crito, Plato's short dialogue Crito, which takes place after his trial when he's in prison, Socrates is fully, as I was talking about Martin Luther King, he's willing to accept the penalty of the law and to accept responsibility for his actions, and drink the hemlock at the end of the day. So that seems an example of the kind of dignified patriotism that I want to defend. Was Socrates a patriot, though? That's a harder one, because in many ways he famously says in the Apology that the unexamined life is not worth living. He believes clearly that Athens, or every city, is a kind of based on unexamined principles and assumptions, does that mean, all of his fellow citizens are leaving? It seems to suggest all of his fellow citizens are living in some ways unworthy lives, lives not worth living. Is there no value for him in the life of an ordinary citizen who supports their country, and so on? So that seems quite unpatriotic in another way, or it's a way of saying perhaps only the philosopher can be a patriot in the highest sense of that term, which would be a very weird thing to believe, that you have to be a philosopher to be a patriot. So Plato ingeniously constructs this in a way to leave us thinking about it, but without a clear answer, without a clearly defined answer, yes or no. There was a political, I'll just say one other thing, there was a political philosopher many, many years ago at Yale named Wilmore Kendall, who kind of wrote during the McCarthy era and was himself a McCarthyite. And he wrote an article about the trial of Socrates and said he got exactly what he deserved, because Socrates was a revolutionary. He was kind of an enemy of the people, and he got at the end of the day exactly what protesters and rebels deserve. It's kind of a harsh and crude view, but it was a very powerful one. So it showed one view, that Socrates was very unpatriotic. I don't accept that in that way, but just use it as an instance.
Well, Socrates isn't necessarily attached to the constitution of his regime, right? Even if he is attached to the people and to the preservation of it, he doesn't necessarily support the view of justice, which his regime agrees with. So he's not an enlightened patriot in the way in which Americans would be. So
just to go on a little bit, I want to dwell. I mean, this is a great question, and I'm inclined to be perhaps dwelling on it too long. I'm not sure that, in the way you put it, Sarah, was very nice, because I'm not sure in Socrates' view there could be such a thing as enlightened patriotism. All politics takes place, if you want to use the famous metaphor from the Republic, all politics takes place in the cave of opinion, of darkness, of myth, of poetry and myth. Enlightenment is something that happens outside the cave, and he seemed to think in a way those two were in the life of the philosopher and the life of the citizen were in a way kind of incompatible, two very different kinds of lives. And I think I'm not sure I agree with Socrates or Plato in that respect. I do think patriotism requires, as I talk about it in the book, it requires education. Our kind of patriotism in particular, it requires learning and education. It's not just a mythos in that way. But let's go on to
okay. Here we have Scott. Scott writes, our class recently discussed the role of slavery in the founding years of the Constitution. What is your opinion of why the founders allowed slavery to exist in our otherwise enlightened past, and how could someone be patriotic upon learning this?
Well, like anything, I'm teaching a course on Lincoln now, where we're looking at the question, among other things, of slavery in the past. This is something that the founders struggled with. I mean, there's a kind of view that I think is out there today, that the founders were just because many of them owned slaves, it was somehow a white supremacist republic based upon the cornerstone of slavery and racial hierarchy. I don't believe that. Why do I say that? Because from the beginning of the Constitution and the founding, slavery was constantly debated by the framers, even those who owned slaves. Jefferson, for example, if you've probably studied this, Scott, in your class, the original draft version of the Declaration of Independence contained a passionate denunciation of slavery, which he had to take out because other delegates, didn't thought they would not be able to achieve a kind of agreement on independence if the denunciation of slavery was there. Okay, it was taken out, but it's evidence that slavery was debated, and even Jefferson, a slave owner, was able to put that in. To take a couple of other examples, the Constitution employed, the infamous, 3/5 clause. In the South, they were not willing to accept the humanity of the enslaved people, but they still wanted them counted for the purposes of representation. And the agreement was a 3/5 clause. But at the same time, the other side of that, or another dimension of that, was the agreement that the slave trade would be abolished in 20 years after the signing of the document in 1808. So you can see from the beginning, slavery, again, far from just being accepted as a fact, is debated as a bone of contention among many different people. And I think once a student becomes aware of the fact that slavery is something slavery, and then after slavery, racial inequality that we still struggle with, once we realize that we realize that this is both a part of who we have been, but also something we've been struggling with all along, I hope you come to, a better appreciation, I would say, of the founders and again, their struggles in a world that is not perfect. I mean.
Thank you. So here I have a question from David Fott from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas.
Uh-huh.
Because the Latin root of nationalism implies a people of a common birth,
Uh-huh.
and the ultimate Latin root of patriotism is pater, or father,
Right.
Isn't it an uphill battle, maybe a struggle against nature, to try to distinguish patriotism as a unity based on ideas from nationalism?
Thank you, David. I don't think we've met, but I have read and appreciated your work over the years. So I didn't know you were here at AU, but nice to hear you from you. It may be an uphill battle. It may be an uphill battle. Sarah, could you just repeat a struggle against nature? Was that
Yes.
what it said? Could you repeat that again?
Sure. Because of the common Latin roots in birth, basically, isn't it an uphill battle and maybe a struggle against nature to try to distinguish patriotism as a unity based on ideas from nationalism?
Okay. Well, a struggle against nature, I don't know about that. That's maybe making too much. Hard to ascribe nature to it, but I would agree. It's a struggle. It's a struggle to make that distinction. But I think it's a distinction worth making. I learned years ago when I spent a little too much time studying ordinary language philosophy of a certain kind, that these words we use are a register of kind of all of the distinctions we feel it worth making. And the fact that we have different words for these things, nationalism and patriotism, says that there's something different about them. I mean, we may argue over where the difference is and what it means and so on, but they are different. And it does seem to me that while it may be a struggle, it's not a struggle that's somehow rooted in nature. But our one of the things, again, the nationalist in many ways, and we've seen this in a lot of the recent language about nationalism, they don't like the idea that American patriotism is rooted in concepts and ideas, or that it has this sort of aspirational quality that I've described in the book. They don't like this. They want to say it's much more it is much more like other kinds of nationalisms rooted in the soil. But that to me is very contrary to our experience as a people and as a nation, our people as a people and a nation. We have always been a people, I mean, going back not just to the constitutional founders, but to the Puritan founders who did think of themselves as, a people of the book, bringing, a certain kind of text-based, idea to what this new world was, the people on the hill and all that. That has been deeply embedded in the American, I think, ideal self-consciousness of who we are. And this recent attempt to kind of write that out of our experience is again a kind of revisionist history that I don't agree with.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of nation part implies a kind of common birth which makes us think of ethnicity. But this question does raise this sort of notion of what is the left of the pater in your understanding of patriotism, or the patria, which seems to refer to kind of the country as one's father, as opposed to
Right.
not necessarily the land of one's fathers, right? Because you could come from somewhere else, but the patria as one's father,
Right.
The thing that made you what you are. Perhaps that sort of is where we get the emotional attachment to it, and what is appealing to people, and that seems to sometimes be absent from a kind of more cerebral sort of patriotism, like Habermas's, for example.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, I mean, and certainly, our greatest patriot, Lincoln, used that kind of language of generation and birth in the Gettysburg Address. A nation was founded in, he uses the language of generation and birth, that kind of rootedness, that language. To be sure, that's been very powerful. It's poetic. It's it's kind of mythic in a certain way. It's powerful language. Perhaps because I've been too much influenced over my life by the study of political philosophy. What I tend to think, it's not so much the patris is the kind of thing. It is what political philosophers call the regime that is the central fact of the regime, which is sometimes in Greek the politeia, the regime, is sometimes thought of as the constitution, as a way of life, as a form, not just a body of laws and distribution of powers and the like, although it's certainly that as well, but it embodied in a way of life to our ethos, as it were, our manners and customs, what it is that, why when you go to, Germany or you go to England or somewhere, you're in a restaurant, you always can tell right away who the American, if there's an American there, from the accent, from many other parts of body language and so on. We kind of identify ourselves. We have practices and habits that make us different in certain ways. And that's, of course, that's a part of regime and peoplehood, what is involved in being a people. Once again, I would resist the claim that because that is a sort of indisputable fact of our life, our way of life, that this somehow necessarily drives us then all the way down into the hole of nationalism, that because of that fact, that it's all us against them all the way down. That's where I get off that bus.
Yeah, the worry, I guess, about the slippery slope is what often gives people a
Oh,
distaste for
right.
patriotism and its
Yeah, so
ideals.
I realize that, and my answer, I have a very simple answer to that argument. Read the book. Read
Uh,
the book. It'll answer your questions.
so here's a question from Alan Levine.
Okay.
You speak of being Aristotelian and describe patriotism as a virtue.
Oh.
For Aristotle, as I understand him, virtue is the proper cultivation of a natural faculty, i.e., moderation is the proper regulation of desire, and courage is the proper management of fear. Of
Right.
what human faculty is patriotism a perfection? And if it is primarily a kind of social belonging, why must it exist at the national level, at the national level?
Okay, that's a deeply philosophical question.
We'd switch it up a little.
Maybe beyond there, but I think, okay, but I think I don't use quite that language in talking about this, but I would say that in the book, patriotism. I'm sorry, once again, Sarah, could you just
Sure.
reread that again? I don't want to get the language wrong.
For Aristotle, virtue is the proper cultivation of a natural faculty.
A natural faculty. Okay,
Right.
that's the term I was trying to remember. A natural faculty, to the degree that I think patriotism is a natural faculty. And I said I was was kind of Aristotelian. I didn't mean by that I following every jot and tittle of Aristotle, but the faculty, I would say, of which it is a form is loyalty.
Mhm.
In the book, near the beginning, not at the very beginning, but near the beginning, talks at some length, about loyalty. Patriotism is a form of loyalty. Loyalty is a natural faculty. And patriotism is just one form of that. We have loyalty to, we live in a kind of concentric circle of loyalties to our family, loyalty to our friends, loyalty to institutions, loyalty to sports teams, loyalty to country.
Mhm.
It is one form of loyalty. It is a form. It is one expression of, to use your term, natural faculty. And like every faculty, as you rightly point out, it needs to be educated. It needs to be moderated. It needs to be directed in a certain way. And I talk about this at some length. Loyalty is a very understudied virtue, I think, or faculty
Mhm.
by moral philosophers. It's a troubling virtue in many ways, because it can lead to, at some point I say, it begins to sound, or it can sound sort of like the mafia code of omerta,
Mhm.
in a way, your protection of your own. But it can also be, I think, we can't live without loyalty. It is an edifying quality as well, loyalty to our friends. And I think it can be an edifying quality. But as I said, we live in a web, a network of loyalties. And therefore the conflict of loyalties is inevitable. Western literature begins with just take one example from Antigone.
Mhm.
Sophocles' Antigone, it begins with a conflict of loyalties, whether Antigone is going to be loyal to her brother or family, or she's going to follow the rules of Creon and the state. You can see the tension already there in Western thought. And in the book, I talk closer to the end of it about a range of conflicts of loyalties, and different ways in which those have been treated or attempt to be resolved or not, in different examples of this. So I would say loyalty is a fiercely, once again, I'm just kind of riffing on the book, but I start with a kind of, again, a riff on a famous phrase that is political philosophers, some of those in the audience will know. John Rawls, in his book, a theory of justice, famously begins the book saying justice is the first virtue of social institutions. And I said, no, loyalty is the first virtue of social institutions. Without a kind of loyalty is the cement that holds institutions together and that makes justice and other kinds of virtues possible. So I think that's where I would go with your question, Alan. Thank you, though.
I mean, I think that perhaps you could say one of the reasons why Aristotle sort of says that friendship is not quite a virtue, but maybe a virtue, close to a virtue, is because it being a virtue depends on the object of it. So perhaps loyalty and patriotism are virtues insofar as they're directed towards a good object. So it's a little bit different from, something like justice or something like, courage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other passage that comes to mind, which sort of, I think, expresses that concern, is Burke's famous statement that, we need to love our country, but to love our country must be lovable. Our country must be beautiful. So, then of course the suggestion is, what if it's not? Can you love a country that is not lovable in that way, or not beautiful, and what to do?
Yeah, I mean, alternatively, Chesterton says that you don't love things because they're beautiful, but you love them because they're yours, and then you make them beautiful. That's another way of thinking about it.
Well, that sounds good. Okay, I like that.
So here's a question from Gabe Whitbread from Clemson University. Liberalism informs our founding and its enduring principles. Without Locke's legitimation of revolution, our country may not exist at all. But would you agree with those conservatives who insist that Locke's theory encourages people to take down their state? Or do you read Locke as having some room for indulging one's state in some illiberal sin, preserving one's country until it has gone too far? So I guess this is a question about the justification for revolution seems to be built into Lockeanism, but the Patriot, and we're Lockeans, but we're also Patriots. Right.
I mean, that's one way of reading Locke, and it might be, in a way, it sounds a little bit more like Paine than Locke, but Paine was a kind of left-wing Lockean in that respect. So could see Locke in that way. I tend to see Locke as a far more cautious figure than that. And when Jefferson writes in the Declaration, that people are prepared, how does he put it? People are prepared to suffer evils or suffer wrongs so long as you suffer. I think it's kind of closer to Locke in some ways. Locke had a sense that, people aren't rebellious for every slight, it takes a lot, and it should take a lot for people to consider or to invoke the right of revolution. I think Locke, is a more cautious figure in that respect. And I know there's been a long-standing sort of Tory grievance against Locke. Maybe it goes as far back as Hume, who sees Locke's idea of government by consent as kind of opening up the door to permanent revolution. And also Jefferson too, in some of his moods or some of his moments, also seems to kind of go with that. But that's one reading of Locke. But I think there's a more Whiggish reading, which I would subscribe to, which sees Locke as a much greater figure of moderation and caution when it comes to invoking the right. He's very cautious when it comes to invoking the right of revolution. When he did invoke it, or not Locke, when Jefferson invoked it in the Declaration, of course, he said, we have to submit facts to a candid world. We're not, here they are at great length. And I think there was a kind of caution and an awareness that, we're not just invoking revolution, but we have facts and evidence on our side, something which most of the people who invoke revolution don't really have.
It is interesting, though, I mean, that we were talking before about whether the Patriot could be a revolutionary, and that our sort of founding fathers rebelled against their own regime. And now we sort of, the philosophy that comes from that is one that we have to accept in order to be Americans. It's interesting. Okay, so I have a question from Justin Gottschalk. Do you think the mean of patriotism tends more toward the excess of nationalism than the deficiency of cosmopolitanism? And if so, do you recommend any habits or dispositions to offset this imbalance?
Great question. I mean, I suppose the answer to that is yes, in the kind of continuum that I set up. You can see in many ways why patriotism and cosmopolitanism are quite different dispositions, where you have to make a stronger case for why patriotism and nationalism are different. So I think you're right. In the broad continuum, I think there's a tendency towards tilt in that direction. So the question, which is a very good one, is what do you do, or what can be done to offset that? And I think, excuse me, I think we have to, a couple of things perhaps, and this is maybe, I don't want to become repetitive about this, but I think to recall that ours is a patriotism of aspiration. It's a patriotism of inclusion. And it's a patriotism that values, human diversity is one way of doing it. I mean, to be honest, one reason I wrote the book, it wasn't the only reason, but certainly a prominent reason, was I wanted to speak to people of, I'll say, the left of center, the center left, people in my party, to be honest, not to give up on patriotism, which I think is all too common on the left, for the reasons that have been said. It's tainted. It seems to be tainted with nationalism, and therefore something that's undesirable. I think once you say that, you've given up. You've given the game away. Liberals can't afford to do that. They can't afford to make that move. Americans are a patriotic people, and there's nothing wrong with being patriotic. It's a decent, and it can be a decent and an ennobling disposition, as I talk about in the book. And part of the book was an attempt to convince those, I mean, I doubt those in the far left have any interest in it, but at least those of the liberal left, the left of, the center left, to reclaim the language of patriotism. And for that matter, those on the right as well, those on the conservative but not reactionary right, to reclaim patriotism from what I think of is its abuse. But I do think, in answer to the question, it's a very important thing to show that patriotism, and to prevent it from just being hijacked by a reactionary nationalist movement that will make bad use of it. When people on January 6th shouted, "Patriots to the front," that to me was a horrendous misuse of a valuable word.
I think just to play devil's advocate for a moment, I think the self-understanding of some of those people would be that they were the ones who were on the side of defending the sort of foundational principles of America and the rule of law, et cetera. I'm not necessarily the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, but at least some of who you would, I think, include in the nationalist group.
Right.
That they seem, at least that their self-understanding is that they're trying to support the rule of law.
Well, that's the language. I mean, certainly that is the language, and I don't, it's yes, absolutely. The question is what they choose to do with it, how they choose to apply that. when someone says that only half the people in America can be considered real Americans, you know, you
Right.
have to wonder, something has gone very, very wrong.
So I have one more question. I don't know who this is from again, but you talk about Lincoln as an example of enlightened patriotism. Is there anyone who you think of today who is a good example of enlightened patriotism?
Of course. Well, of course, there have been many examples, and you know, I talked about MLK. I mean, he's not today, but MLK is being an example of a certain kind of enlightened patriotism. And you know, there are many. You know, it's a good question, and of course there are. They don't have to be heroes of patriotism. You don't have to be a hero of patriotism to do this. Patriotism, you know, one of the points I want to make in the book is that patriotism is and should be a kind of lowercase virtue. It's not something, you know, that we just need at moments of great national crisis, you know, England in 1940, June, or something like that, you know. Patriotism is an everyday, and it should be an everyday disposition that forms the kind of common opinion and basis of a democratic society, of our society. So I don't think I mean, I use examples like Lincoln or MLK or Rosa Parks. These are high moments of a certain kind of national patriotism. But one of the things I want to do also is to reclaim it for more for kind of ordinary uses and ordinary people. So I don't want to just sit here and give kind of a list of, you know, kind of like a greatest hits list of, you know, great American patriots. We could all do that. But I want to say in our everyday practices and beliefs, I think this is something we should all strive to embody in some way, to embrace.
Great. Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much, Professor Smith, for joining us today. I know I've very much enjoyed talking to you. And thank you all for coming and for your wonderful questions. And I hope to see you now again at one of our events.
Let me just say too, Sarah, thank you very much. Love the questions, and I especially love the give and take, the Q&A. I wish I could have been there with you, but my teaching schedule is busy. But anyway, this has been terrific. I've enjoyed it, and thank you all very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.